Last year, they counted at least 993 executions. That's 4% fewer than in 2016 and 39% fewer than in 2015.
Death row. The very term sends chills down the spine, but in Asia, it's a nightmare for many. For years, countries like China, Japan, and Vietnam have been carrying out executions that leave a trail of horror and mystery behind. The thing is, not much is said about what really happens behind the closed doors of these grim procedures. With little transparency and even less humanity at times, some executions have become infamous for their cruelty. But what really makes these cases stand out? Let's dive into some of the most horrific death row stories in Asia, uncovering the secrets, the injustices, and the shocking realities that have left the world speechless. When you think about death row, the first thing that comes to mind might be the finality of it all. The last breath, the last words. But what's often forgotten is what happens before the execution. The isolation, the waiting, the constant uncertainty. In Asia, the execution process is shrouded in secrecy, leaving prisoners, their families, and the world in the dark. But behind these dark walls, some of the most horrific executions have occurred, with methods so brutal that they leave lasting scars on both the condemned and society as a whole.
A series of 8-year-old photographs is currently making the rounds on the internet in China. As Celia Hatton tells us, despite their age, the death row images are shedding new light on a country that executes far more people than any other country in the world.
Let's take a look at China first, where the death penalty has been notoriously secretive. China is known for its high number of executions, but the government refuses to release official statistics, and what little information gets out is often inconsistent. In fact, Amnesty International's 2014 report
welcome to this briefing by Amnesty International. Reflects the urgency for China to reform its death penalty.
Pointed out that the country's practice of executing individuals is kept under a shroud of secrecy, with no public details or even official confirmation of when these executions take place. One of the methods China uses is firing squads, though lethal injection is also becoming more common. But what makes the firing squad so disturbing is its brutal finality. In some cases, prisoners are shot in the back of the head, a method designed for efficiency, but one that leaves little dignity. There's no public record of the number of people executed by firing squad each year, which means families don't even get a chance to grieve properly. It's the kind of cold, impersonal act that makes death feel less like a legal decision and more like an execution without humanity. Another disturbing aspect of China's execution practices is the use of foreign nationals as part of the grim statistic.
A death sentence for a 53-year-old British man has been carried out, marking the first time in 50 years that a European is being executed in China. Akmal Sheikh had been convicted of drug trafficking, but his family says he was the victim of a criminal gang.
People from different countries, who are often caught in politically sensitive situations or entangled in the country's strict anti-drug laws, find themselves facing a death sentence with little chance of survival. For example, in 2014, an Australian national, Andrew Chan, was arrested for drug trafficking in China, only to be sentenced to death by firing squad. The secrecy surrounding his case kept his family in the dark, not knowing when or how his execution would unfold. But China isn't the only Asian country with a chilling death penalty history. Vietnam, like many Southeast Asian nations, has been involved in the execution of criminals in the most secretive of circumstances.
In other news, a court in Vietnam has sentenced 27 people to death for drug trafficking. According to reports, the court found them guilty of trafficking more than 600 kilos of narcotics from Cambodia into Vietnam.
Vietnam executes a wide range of people, from drug offenders to those convicted of violent crimes. But it's the lack of transparency that makes the situation even more horrific. Executions often happen in the dead of night, with no prior announcement to the public, and families often find out after the fact. One case that stuck out was that of Nguyen Duc Hoang, a Vietnamese man sentenced to death in 2016. He was convicted of drug trafficking, a crime punishable by death in Vietnam. However, his family wasn't notified of his execution until after it had taken place. This secrecy robs not just the individual of their dignity, but their loved ones of the opportunity to say goodbye or seek justice. The Vietnamese government has been known for keeping death row cases under wraps, preventing the media from reporting on the actual events surrounding executions. As horrifying as the secrecy is, there's something even more unsettling about the psychological toll that death row inmates face. Imagine being on death row, knowing that your execution could happen at any time, but you aren't told when. That's the nightmare that many prisoners in Japan live through. Japan's method of execution is hanging, and it's carried out with such secrecy that many inmates are never informed of their execution date until the very last minute. In Japan, death row inmates live in a state of constant uncertainty. They're placed in solitary confinement, and the exact timing of their execution is a mystery. In some cases, the condemned are told about their fate just hours before they are hanged. It's a psychological torment that's impossible to imagine, living day after day, not knowing if today will be the day that your life ends. And when the day comes, it's not announced to the public beforehand, and often, the families aren't informed until after the execution.
The case of Iwa Hakamada shining a spotlight on the Japanese justice system. Now 78, the former boxing champion confessed to killing a family of 4.
The case of Hakamada Iwao illustrates just how brutal Japan's death penalty system can be. Hakamada was wrongfully imprisoned for 48 years on death row before he was exonerated in 2014. Imagine spending nearly 5 decades in solitary confinement, knowing only that your life could be snuffed out at any time. It's a haunting reality that shows how Japan's system doesn't just punish the condemned. It destroys them mentally long before the execution. The death penalty in Asia isn't just about punishing those who commit heinous crimes. It's deeply political, often used as a weapon of control, intimidation, and fear. Governments in some Asian countries don't just use capital punishment to deal with criminals. They use it to send a message. It's a display of power, a public demonstration that those who challenge the state or violate its laws will pay the ultimate price. In some places, it's almost like a game of politics, where human lives are used as pawns to manipulate public perception and bolster the government's image. Take Indonesia, for example. This Southeast Asian nation has been notorious for its stance on the death penalty, particularly when it comes to drug trafficking.
I have breaking news right now, so I want to ask your reaction on this breaking news. Mary Jane Veloso, the Filipino OFW, is coming home to the Philippines after being arrested for drug trafficking in Indonesia.
In 2015, Indonesia made global headlines when it executed 10 drug offenders, including foreign nationals, by firing squad. Among them was Mary Jane Veloso, a Filipino woman who had been sentenced to death for attempting to smuggle heroin into the country. Despite widespread pleas for clemency from around the world, Indonesian President Joko Widodo made it clear that the country's strict anti-drug stance would not be compromised. He even warned that Indonesia would continue executing drug offenders without hesitation. The firing squad method used in Indonesia is both brutal and public, designed to make a statement about the government's determination to fight drug-related crime. But what's even more chilling is the way these executions are carried out. In many cases, the prisoners are told the night before their execution, and they are given no opportunity to say goodbye to their families. While the government claims these executions are necessary for national security, critics argue that they do little to curb drug use or trafficking. In fact, some studies have shown that executions do nothing to reduce the number of drug-related crimes, making one wonder whether these public executions are more about maintaining political power than achieving any meaningful social good. The Indonesian government's use of the death penalty is a prime example of how the state can use capital punishment as a political tool to unite the nation against a common enemy, whether real or imagined. In 2015, the country even executed 2 Australian nationals, Andrew Chan and Mayuran Sukumaran, for their involvement in a drug trafficking ring, further demonstrating how death row can be used as a bargaining chip on the international stage. The execution sparked outrage in Australia, but the Indonesian government showed no signs of backing down, making it clear that the death penalty was a key part of their political agenda. But Indonesia isn't the only country in Asia that uses executions for political purposes. In countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, the death penalty often carries a heavy political undertone. These countries have a long history of using executions not just to punish criminals, but to reinforce their political authority. In fact, the Singaporean government has long maintained that capital punishment is a necessary deterrent for drug crimes, even though there's little evidence to support its effectiveness. One of the most controversial methods used in Singapore is hanging, which has been the standard form of execution for decades. The practice is swift, but it's also a chilling reminder of the country's hardline stance on crime. In 2015, Singapore executed Koh Jabing, a Malaysian national, for a murder conviction. Despite pleas for clemency from international organizations and even Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak, Singapore proceeded with the execution. The fact that Singapore's government could dismiss international calls for mercy underscores the deep political role that executions play in maintaining the country's strict laws and public image. While Singapore's method of hanging is relatively quick compared to some other methods, it still serves the purpose of instilling fear in the public. Imagine being caught in a legal system where your life can be taken away for a crime that, in some cases, might have been committed in a moment of desperation. For many, the sheer swiftness of the execution process makes it all the more terrifying. It's not just about the crime, it's about the power of the state to take control of your life. But beyond the borders of Southeast Asia, there's another country that brings execution to the next level of political theater: North Korea. The secretive and brutal regime in Pyongyang has long used executions as a tool to eliminate political rivals and suppress dissent. Many of these executions are carried out in private, often without the condemned ever being publicly named. The method of execution? Firing squad is common, as well as execution by anti-aircraft gun. It's a chilling display of power, one designed to keep the population in line through fear and intimidation. North Korea's political purges are infamous, with high-ranking officials being executed for even the slightest perceived betrayal or disloyalty to the regime. For example, in 2013, Jang Song-thaek, the uncle of Kim Jong-un, was executed by firing squad after being accused of treason and plotting a coup. His execution, carried out in front of high-ranking officials, sent a clear message to anyone thinking of challenging the regime. In a country where death is often the result of political disagreements, execution becomes a tool to maintain absolute control over the population. The sheer scale of political executions in North Korea, many of which are carried out without any kind of legal process or transparency, reveals the terrifying extent to which death row can be weaponized for political purposes. And with methods as extreme as anti-aircraft guns and firing squads, it's clear that these executions are meant to instill terror in both the public and any potential dissenters. The death penalty isn't just a physical act, it's a psychological one too. For those languishing on death row, the waiting itself becomes a form of torture. The uncertainty of when their final day will arrive, the isolation from the outside world, and the psychological toll of knowing their life could end at any moment can break a person. But it's not just the waiting, it's also the brutal methods used to carry out these executions that leave a permanent mark on the condemned. In Thailand, the use of lethal injection began in 2003, but the method hasn't been widely used due to complications in finding the necessary drugs. Much like in China, Thailand's authorities have occasionally faced difficulties acquiring the drugs needed for executions. This has led to a backlog of prisoners on death row, awaiting their fate, in a system that already makes a profound psychological impact on the condemned. The toll of being held in limbo, waiting for an uncertain future, is a fate in itself. It's no surprise that many human rights advocates argue that keeping people on death row for years, sometimes even decades, causes irreversible harm, far before the actual method of execution even comes into play. But one of the most unsettling parts of Asia's death penalty practices is how governments continue to use the threat of execution as a tool of political control. The death penalty has become more than just a way to punish crime. It's used to silence political dissent, to quash opposition, and to remind the population of the absolute power of the state. Whether it's North Korea's grotesque execution by anti-aircraft gun or the state-sponsored purges in China, the message is clear. There is no room for opposition. The fear of death is enough to keep many people in line, both physically and psychologically. As the international community grows louder in its calls for the abolition of the death penalty, there's hope that some countries in Asia will take steps to end this brutal practice. While nations like Japan and Singapore maintain their hardline stance on capital punishment, others, such as Nepal and Mongolia, have taken bold steps toward abolition. In recent years, the number of executions has declined in some Asian countries, which could signal a shift toward more progressive attitudes toward justice. However, the road to abolition is still a long one. It's hard to predict whether countries like China, Indonesia, or North Korea will ever abandon the death penalty, given how intertwined it is with political power and control. But what is clear is that there's growing resistance to these brutal practices. People are beginning to see that the death penalty is not a solution to crime, but a human rights violation that perpetuates cycles of violence, suffering, and fear. In the end, what's truly horrifying about the death penalty in Asia is not just the methods used, but the system that keeps people living in fear, uncertainty, and isolation. The psychological torment of waiting for death, the secrecy surrounding executions, and the extreme brutality of some methods leave permanent scars on the condemned and their families. Whether it's firing squads in Vietnam, hanging in Japan, or execution by anti-aircraft gun in North Korea, the message is the same. The death penalty is an inhumane, outdated practice that does nothing to solve the root causes of crime or injustice. As we continue to shed light on these disturbing practices, we hope for a future where capital punishment is no longer a tool used to oppress, silence, and control. Until that day comes, it's up to the international community to continue pushing for change, and for every person to remember that every life, no matter the crime, is valuable. Only by breaking the cycle of violence, fear, and retribution can we begin to build a future where justice isn't measured by the taking of lives, but by the respect and dignity we show each other.